Hello. Sorry about all the back and forth with the class today. I hope that everyone got my messages appropriately and it wasn't a huge deal to be canceling our Zoom. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we were going to be discussing today in class. So we started talking the other day about different types of abuse, family violence. We talked a little bit about child abuse, elder abuse, some of the dynamics there, and got into some intimate partner violence a little bit. We talked a little bit about same-sex relationships and some of the dynamics that might be present there, which are very similar to the relationship dynamics in heterosexual relationships. Obviously, there are some extra hurdles for same-sex couples in terms of their being accepted in society in the first place. And we know that that is challenging in some areas of our society, that stigma that is sort of created about the same-sex couple dynamic, can bring on other layers of maybe lack of concern if there might be abuse going on, or, lack of understanding that the abuse dynamics, regardless of, who you are, what your sexual orientation is, really what your gender identity might be, any of those factors that we don't always take into consideration in some parts of society, that people, regardless of who they are, how they identify, can be abused, can be victims of abuse. And so I think that's really probably the most important thing that we can mention when it comes to same-sex couples. Certainly other different other designations can be considered as well. So I want to talk briefly, I'll try to go very briefly about the different types of abuse that we might see and the cycle of violence, and maybe a little bit about some of the consequences, which I think we got into, and a little bit about the supports that might be available. So different types of abuse. The most obvious type of abuse is physical abuse. And I think when we think of any sort of abusive situation, domestic violence, we do think of the physical. And that's usually always present. It might not be present right away, but it's always present at some point. People are arrested for the physical abuse. That's where we see charges being levied against a person, or going through the court system, or maybe being put in prison, or having a restraining order, that there could be legal components to that because of the physical abuse. But the other types of abuse are really important, and sometimes are overlooked in terms of the significance of the power of abusive behavior. The emotional abuse, or mental abuse, or psychological abuse, however you want to term it, is probably one of the most powerful types of abuse, and it is probably the most harmful type of abuse. That many victims will often say that the psychological manipulation and the control and the putting people down, and it goes with verbal abuse, name calling, things like that. But it's really hard. And there's, thinking about even just physical abuse, the trauma that goes with physical abuse can also be considered the psychological abuse. So they all do go hand in hand. So there's physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. People can be arrested, obviously, and charged with sexual abuse, but that's really hard. We don't see a lot of charges in relationships that people are dating or married. Obviously, these intimate partner violence, sexual assaults are not usually reported the same way that maybe a physical assault is reported. It really depends on the situation. So sexual abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse. Sometimes there's using the children kind of as pawns. That's a different type of abuse. The intimidating people, the threats, the financial pieces of it, the controlling everything. So there's all these different types of abuse. Most abusive relationships do not start with like a physical type of abuse, because most people would walk away immediately. There's no attachment there yet. A truly good abuser, that's a terrible term to use, but abusers are very clever. They're very manipulative. They are very charming. Oftentimes when abuser is finally discovered for who they are, their true colors, people around them are shocked because they seem like such a nice person and they would never have thought that they'd be behaving like this or have done this, whatever they did to their partner. but they're very manipulative, and they put on a good face, and so they draw you in. You know, a good abuser is someone who, I'm sorry, I keep using that term, and that's really not appropriate, but they are skilled at drawing you in and making you have a connection to them, and they're charming, and they wine and dine you and give you gifts and shower you with love, that you think maybe all of this attention is really positive, and maybe you found this person, when maybe a lot of this attention is in an effort to control you. You know, the jealousy or the always texting or having to know where you are at all times sometimes can be an indicator of a abusive relationship, with the manipulation and the power and the control that's there. So they lure people in, and sometimes as you go along, and certainly as hindsight is always very reflective of this, you can be able to identify different types of abuse that were going on from the beginning, but you didn't know it at the time. It could be something like jealousy. It could be something like possessiveness that might be charming, and you might think, oh, they just really care about me. And it really is more of a sign of they are trying to control you, and they think they own you. It usually works up to different types of physical abuse, sexual abuse. And so that's when you see people are usually kind of committed and connected. They might be in love. They might have planned their lives together, when it starts getting more intense and you really start seeing a different side of the person. So most of the time in abusive relationships, you'll see all the different types of abuse. They are utilized at different times for different reasons, and they are very good at controlling people. They're very good at isolating people. You know, oftentimes you'll have an abuser say something like, I don't like your family, I don't like your friends, they don't like me, I don't want you near them. And a victim in the situation will often learn, if she or he goes near those people, there might be punishment that they have to face for it. And so sometimes it's just easier not to go near those people. And this is part of the abusive person's tactics. They're trying to isolate you. So you have nowhere else to go. They tend to be your only place that you can go. Very harmful. And isolation is really hard when you're finally maybe trying to get out of this abusive situation and you don't know where to go. You don't know who you can call. You don't know if anyone will continue to support you if you've stopped talking to them or going out with them, or kind of pulled away from them. So it's a really challenging place to be, especially when you're feeling really lonely and you desperately need help. That is one of the tips, if we jump forward a little bit, is that if you know someone who you think is in an abusive relationship, be there for them, support them. They're not going to want to be told what to do. They're not going to want your opinion on where they should go or how they should handle it, because they have somebody that's telling them what to do all the time. They need to make these decisions on their own. But if they know that you are there for them and can support them, and you will be there for them, maybe when they choose to leave or they need you, that's all they need to know. Sometimes that's really hard for the individuals trying to help their friend or family member. You're just kind of playing the waiting game and you're worried about your friend or family member, but that's the best thing you can do. So supporting the victim, regardless of the decisions they make, even if you don't agree with them, you're not in their shoes, so you don't understand why they're making those decisions, but support them. And that's the most important piece for them. So lots of different types of abuse. Within the slideshow, you can see descriptions in there's a power and control wheel that talks about the different types of abuse. The manipulation, which includes like the minimize, deny, blame, justify behaviors. Well, I had to do this because you made me do it. There's always a reason to blame others or justify the behaviors that we see abusers engaging in. Another slide talks about the cycle of violence, or cycle of abuse, I think it's called in this slideshow, and maybe some of you have heard about it. As we know, abuse is cyclical, and there can be in these abusive relationships times that are calmer, like the down period, the apologetic period, and then the time period where it's more of like the tension building and like the walking on eggshells, and it builds back up to the abusive behavior. And this happens in every relationship. You'll see victims who say we go back and forth, but then they were so nice and they were apologetic and they cried, and then it repeats itself. And not only does it repeat itself, and then we mentioned this in class the other day, within that relationship itself, these can be generational cycles. We can see these different types of abusive cycles that go from generation to generation, and then how they are learned behaviors, which is very alarming as well. And it's really hard to break these cycles. Generationally, it's really hard, but certainly in individual relationships, it's really hard. People stay out of love. They actually do love their abuser. They probably may have been in love with them at some point, and even though they know they're being abused and being treated horribly, they still love them. They want to believe them when they apologize. They want to move on and have their relationship and their family, keep their family together, or maybe they're married, keep their marriage together. And so there's a lot that goes into that trust with love, even though they've probably betrayed the trust. So there's love, there's fear, right? Everybody has a certain fear. They have most likely been the victim of some horrible physical abuse or other types of abuse, and they know what that person's capable of, and they're fearful if they try to leave, the retaliation, they'll find them, whatever, hurting the children, all of it. So they're very fearful. The other reason that people stay is, there's a lot of different reasons people stay. These are sort of overarching. Another component of fear might be the financial piece, that a lot of times victims don't have any control over any sort of money, even if it's their own money. If they're out working and making their own money, the abuser usually takes control. So they have no means, they have no resources to be able to leave. Sometimes you will find victims who are kind of taking a few dollars here and there and hiding it. So if and when they choose to leave, they have some money to go with them. So there's a fear of not being able to provide for yourself, support yourself. There's also the fear of being alone, that sometimes people truly believe it's better to be with someone, even if they're being treated this way, than going into the unknown and being alone, and how scary that is. Lots of different fears that people experience. We should not judge them for it. We don't know, unless we're in their shoes, what they're experiencing, what they've been told, how harmed they've been, how psychologically harmed they've been. So it's hard. But the other reason that people stay, a big reason, kind of an overarching reason, is hope. That they're always very hopeful for change. They are hopeful that the person will make a change, will truly say, I'm not going to do it again, and I'm going to get help, or I'm going to do better. And they want to believe in that. And they want to believe that maybe their fairy tale will come true sometime. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually end that way. It's the idea of, you have this calm phase, like the honeymoon phase, where everything's good, and you're kind of cruising along. And then again, you get to that like tension building phase, and you know that you're on edge, and you're not sure like what you could do that might make them snap, because victims are really good at blaming themselves. Victims are never the reason that someone might snap, but they're made to believe that. And so that's that tension building phase that very quickly can lead into the abuse phase. When some sort of abuse happens, whether it's physical or verbal or emotional or sexual or all of the above, there's that incident phase. And then as things calm down, it goes back into the calming phase. It could be I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I was drunk, and all the excuses made for it, or you did something wrong and pissed me off, but I'm better now, and I forgive you, and very much turning it on to blame the victim. Sometimes, again, they cry. Sometimes there's gifts. Sometimes there's flowers. They just want to make it right. And so, people do want to believe, and sadly, because this is a cycle, it just goes back around, that this, apologetic phase goes back into like the tension building phase, goes back into the abuse phase, and back around and back around and back around. And people will stay in this cycle an average of 7 to 10 times before they even think of maybe trying to get out or leave or get a restraining order, or, make some decision that would mean they're not in this relationship anymore, and what that might mean for them. So the cycle of violence is really, really challenging. There are similar components for everybody who's in an abusive relationship, but then there's obviously differences within those relationships in terms of how it's enacted. But people are usually very familiar with the cycle of violence when they've gotten out of an abusive relationship, and it does sound similar. Obviously, hopefully people can successfully leave these relationships, and there's many different ways they can do that. There are support services, there are restraining orders, there are shelter services, transitional housing. It's not ideal, but there are some, many services out there for the victims of abuse, particularly women and children, who are more often than not the abuse victims. But it doesn't come with, any sort of, there's so much healing that needs to be done, and trauma that has been a part of victims' lives, that even if they successfully get out of the relationship, it doesn't mean they're better. It doesn't mean, oh, they have a fresh outlook on life. There's still a lot of anxiety and depression and fear and a lack of trust, always looking over their shoulder, always wondering, if this person's going to come after them. So many different pieces, maybe having to live like in hiding and in secret. You can see similar things with children, like depression, anxiety, poor performance in school, behavioral issues. There can be different types of drug or alcohol usage among adults or among children that kind of try to just use those as a coping mechanism, more along the lines like you could see like the trauma disorders, PTSD. So there can be long-lasting effects of this type of this abuse on these family members for years and years and years to come. People might be hesitant to ever get into a relationship again, or maybe they get into a relationship again and it's also an abusive relationship. We do see these repeated patterns that people get out of a relationship and they don't actually know what a healthy relationship is. They're used to someone treating them that way. And so sometimes they get back into these where they are manipulated and controlled by another person. So there's so many layers to this. And it really is important to support people. It is important for them to engage in support services, counseling, therapies, not just for, the partner, but for children who might be in this situation. And it's also important to acknowledge the abuser, and the abuser who, should have repercussions, should be caught and maybe prosecuted, maybe have to go to domestic violence intervention classes, maybe does some prison time, depending on the crime, whatever may have happened. But you also have to look at some of the therapeutic components and the healing that person needs to go through in order to not behave like this again in their lives. And so that's not a piece we always look at. It is part of our criminal justice system, but sometimes people, kind of go through the motions of a particular class and then they get back out and do it again. Anger management is not usually the best place to send domestic violence abusers, because anger management learns to blame our behaviors on when we get angry. And if we can control our anger, then we won't have these types of behaviors. Domestic violence is very calculating and controlled. And yes, sometimes there's anger involved, but blaming anger is not an effective way to deal with domestic violence, because people really do act very controlled, very cool, very calculated when they are engaging in abusive behaviors. And so to say, when we learn our triggers for getting angry, that'll help us, we're not dealing with the appropriate triggers for domestic violence. So that's not a good place to send people if they've been convicted of domestic violence. Okay. I talked a little bit longer than I intended to, but thank you for listening. So, have a nice weekend, everyone. Happy snow day. It turned out to be a snow day for us inadvertently, and I will see you all on Tuesday. As I mentioned, next week we are dealing with deviance in the workplace, but in particular, we are dealing with political deviance workplace, political deviance in the workplace, deviance in the political workplace. I don't know how to say it. Anyway, have a nice weekend, everyone, and I will see you on Tuesday. Bye-bye.